Nijūichidaishū, the 21 imperial anthologies of Japanese poetry. While I'm on my way on the train, why don't I pass the time by telling you a few things about the anthologies, imperial collections, as an introduction to the exhibition. So, let's get started. While I'm on the train speeding south, let's pass the time with a short consideration of what the 21 imperial poetry anthologies are and what they mean. First of all, let's think about the period which they cover. The first one, Kokin Wakashu, Anthology of Ancient and Modern Japanese Poetry, was completed around 905, at the beginning of the 10th century. The last anthology, Shinshoku Kokin Wakashu, New Continued Anthology of Ancient and Modern Japanese Poetry, was completed in 1439, so they span a period of poetic development of just over 500 years. At the beginning, Waka, Japanese poetry, was a new literary genre, in the sense that the Japanese were beginning to think about and define the features of it that differentiated it from poetry written in Chinese, or other types of words arranged in particular patterns or vocalized in particular ways, such as songs. By the time of the last anthology, Waka was a proud and conservative tradition, with a significant body of critical theory to define what was and wasn't poetically acceptable in terms of diction, imagery, and topic. Also at the beginning, poetry was generally written by men and women as part of their daily lives, and in service to other activities, whether that be having love affairs, communicating with friends, family, or superiors, or expressing feelings and emotions. Most poets, then, were amateurs in the sense that they didn't need to make their way in the world with their poetry, for all that they composed it frequently. By the time of the last anthology, poetry was often an end in itself, and many poets were just that, men and women whose main business was the writing and often teaching of poetry. There had been, therefore, in Robert Huey's words, a professionalisation of poetic practice. With this professionalisation, though, came factionalism and different competing ideas of what poetry should be. In fact, the competition was so fierce and positions became so entrenched that it was virtually impossible for rival poets to speak to each other. There's even a case where the head of one poetic house, Niju, was so outraged by the fact that the head of another, Kyogoku Tamekane, was given a commission to compile an imperial anthology in 1311, that he sued in the shogunal courts in Kamakura in an attempt to prevent it. He failed, but the fact that he was prepared to go to such lengths demonstrates both the intensity of the rivalry and the seriousness with which such work was regarded. What this factionalism means is that in the later anthologies, we see less of a broad church and more narrow portrayals of what Waka was at the time. It's important to remember, though, that these are imperial anthologies, and thus their status, commissioning, and reception is intimately connected with the status of the imperial institution as it rose and fell. That is to say, that it's impossible to think of the Nijūichidaishū as wholly literary works. They are political as much as they are literary, and often the reasons why an anthology was commissioned lay in the political upheavals as much as they did in a love of literature. Compiling an anthology was both an honour for the chosen compiler and a burden. The men chosen, and it was always men, would resign from their other posts and devote themselves wholeheartedly to the endeavour. Sometimes, when the emperor was particularly invested in the project, the role would come with support in the form of space in the imperial palace, as well as scribes and other officials. Sometimes it would be more of a solo endeavour, conducted at the compiler's residence, with the help of his family, retainers, and students. The compiler, or compilers, would have to read through large numbers of earlier and recent poems to make their selections. They needed to balance the competing priorities of poetic quality and social status to ensure that important individuals weren't slighted. They needed to ensure that none of their selected poems had previously been included in another imperial anthology. They had to deal with lobbying by other poets who were eager to have their work receive the cachet of inclusion in an imperial collection. If the commissioning emperor was particularly invested in the project, they also had to ensure that his likes and dislikes were accommodated. It wasn't unheard of for emperors to reject or edit drafts of collections when presented to them for approval. So, the burdens were considerable. So too were the rewards, however. A compiler who completed his work, presented it to the emperor, and had it approved and accepted, was guaranteed immortality, for his name would forever be associated with his collection, and it would shape ideas about Waka for decades to come, or even longer. Of course, there were more prosaic benefits too. A compiler would be in demand at functions held by the high nobility, providing opportunities for the advancement of himself and his house. He would also be in demand as a teacher for the sons and daughters of the elite, which would bring further economic benefits, as well as access to individuals who would one day be ruling court society. Some anthologies had a number of compilers who collaborated to produce the final version. Others were the work of one individual, and some individuals compiled more than one anthology. Some anthologies were short, with only a few hundred poems. Others had 2,000 or more. So, as you can see, there was quite a bit of variety between them. You might be tempted to ask then whether the only thing holding them together was that they were imperial, commissioned by a reigning or retired emperor. The answer to that question is, like all good academic questions, I think, both yes and no. It's true that each anthology was a product of its time, and so the acceptable styles of poetry evolved and changed. It's also true that each was the product of a compiler's or group of compilers' vision, and these changed too. But with that being said, the poetry anthologized was always Waka. The broad outlines of how each anthology was laid out never changed over 500 years. And also, as Stefania Burke has so ably pointed out, each anthology, other than the very first, was shaped by its predecessors. Sometimes compilers sought to follow in the footsteps of what had come before. Sometimes they reacted against it and tried to break new poetic ground while still remaining within the constraints of the Waka tradition. It's even possible to see all 21 anthologies as a single project stretching over the half-millennium of their production, although it will be a rare reader indeed who sought to read them sequentially and in their entirety these days. The total number of poems in all of them combined is 33,662. It's also the case that there are two subgroups within the 21 anthologies, which go by the names of the Sandaishu, the 3 anthologies, and the Ichidaishu, the 8 anthologies. As you can perhaps guess, the first of these is made up of the first 3 anthologies, while the second contains the first 8 anthologies. It's these collections which have generally been considered the finest of the Waka canon, and so these are the works which have attracted the most scholarly attention. More recently, there has been greater attention paid to the later medieval collections, and there have been moves to re-evaluate their quality and contents, as well as to see them as the products of their times. By thinking about who was included and who was not, it's possible to gain extra insight into the changing fortunes of individuals and houses at court and beyond, as well as to track the growing involvement of members of the warrior class, the samurai, in matters poetic. Let's take a step back, though, and return to the origin of the court Waka tradition and the first imperial anthology, the aforementioned Kokin Wakashu, or Kokinshu for short, as this set the standard for, and the shape of, all subsequent collections that came after it. Kokinshu was commissioned by Emperor Daigo and entrusted to a committee of 4 lower-ranking nobles who were known as proficient poets. The 4 men were Kino Tomonori, Oshikochi no Mutsune, Mibu no Tadamine, and Kino Tsurayuki. Next to nothing is known about how they went about gathering the poems for inclusion in the new anthology, nor is it clear how they divided up the responsibilities between them. It seems likely, though, that Tsurayuki played a major role, both because Tomonori died before the anthology was completed, and because he wrote the Japanese preface to the work. I say Japanese preface because Kokinshu has 2, one written in Japanese, known as the Kanajo, and one written in classical Chinese, the Manajo. In broad outline, The contents of both prefaces are the same, and as the man who wrote the Manojo, Kino Yoshimochi, was Tsurayuki's adopted son, it seems likely that it is his that the vision is that it conveys. Nevertheless, the differences which do exist have exercised scholars for centuries, with arguments raging over whether they simply result from linguistic differences between Japanese and Chinese, or conceptual ones. The task that Tsurayuki set himself in his preface, though, was to present, for the first time, a theoretical statement about what Japanese poetry was, to provide initial technical vocabulary for critiquing poems, and to provide examples of poets and poems which demonstrated strengths and weaknesses which could be described in these terms. Some of what he says was adapted from earlier Chinese works on poetics, but much was original. He positions Waka as being divinely inspired, with the first examples of Japanese poetry being produced by the storm god Susanoo no Mikoto. Due to this divine origin, Waka has mysterious powers and can influence the real world in concrete ways. It's not simply frivolous verbiage. Perhaps the single most famous line in the preface, and one which I think all Japanese high school students will still read in their language classes, is Yamato uta wa hito no kokoro o tane toshite yorozu no koto no hato zo narerikeru. Japanese poetry has its seed in the human heart and blossoms forth in a myriad leaves of words. What does Tsurayuki mean by this? Well, what he's saying is that a waka is a response in words, spoken or written, to an emotional stimulus. This stimulus can be either social, the events in a person's life, such as falling in love or going on a journey, or sensual, catching sight of a striking natural scene and wanting to describe both what it looks like and how it makes one feel. In addition, by weaving the phrase yorozu no koto no ha, a myriad leaves of words, into his key statement, Tsurayuki also evokes the earlier Manyōshū poetry anthology, as the title of this collection translates as the collection of a myriad leaves. He thus suggests that waka is a form with a tradition of its own going back centuries, and is, therefore, fit to be considered as having the same merit as poetry in Chinese, which have been enthusiastically adopted by the Japanese court and utilised by a number of emperors to buttress their authority, through adopting Sinitic customs, such as requiring ministers to compose poems in Chinese at state occasions in response to topics provided by the emperor. This reinforced the emperor's position at the ritual centre and pinnacle of the court hierarchy, and provided mystical support to imperial claims to rulership. In any case, Tsurayuki's description of what poetry was absolutely key to virtually all subsequent pre-modern poetics, with later generations either refining it or reacting against it. It should come as no surprise to you then that Kokinshu was the model for all following anthologies to emulate. What was that model though? Well, the anthology is divided into three broad sections. Seasonal poetry, covering the 4 official seasons of spring, summer, autumn and winter, love poetry, and then poems on a range of other topics. It's these latter topics which compilers of later anthologies would modify, removing some and adding others, but none ever challenged the domination of the seasons and love. You can find brief descriptions of the contents of the first 8 anthologies, the ichidaishu, on www.wakapoetry.net if you want to find out more. You'll also find a good bit of translated poetry from them, with Kokinshu and the 8th anthology, Shinkokin Wakashu, the new ancient and modern collection of Japanese poetry, which was presented in 1205, best represented. Why did emperors, or retired emperors, go to the trouble and expense of commissioning and giving their imprimatur to poetry anthologies, though? As I said earlier, producing a chokusenshu, that's the Japanese term for imperial anthology, was not cheap. It's obviously difficult to draw parallels between pre-modern and modern economies, but one estimate is that the production of an imperial anthology placed a similar burden on the Japanese state's resources as conducting a major public works project would, digging a new canal or building an aqueduct and so forth. It should be obvious, then, that emperors initiated the production of these collections because it was a matter of vital importance to the state, or rather, a matter of vital importance to the authority and continuation of the imperial institution. emperors commissioned anthologies to show that they could. They controlled the economic and social resources to produce them, and by doing so, they reinforced the prestige of the imperial institution, even in periods when actual political authority had moved elsewhere in the nobility, or even left it entirely, as was the case once the samurai took over after 1185. While poetry in Chinese never stopped being composed, once the imperial anthology project got underway, Waka generally supplanted kanshi, Chinese poems, as the cultural support to the imperial institution. Chokusenshu, therefore, were always intensely political projects and should be seen as such. Although this is not to deny, of course, that they also contain beautiful poetry, and that the compilers, and at least some of the commissioning emperors, also wanted to leave aesthetic and literary monuments behind them. I hope you found that brief discussion of the Nijūichidaishū, what they mean and how they're composed, to be useful. As you can see, I've made it down to Slough on the train and am now in my hotel where I'm going to be staying the night, and will be going off to the exhibition shortly. One question which may be in your minds, though, is why is a British public school putting on an exhibition about pre-modern Japanese poetry? Well, the answer to that question lies in diplomacy, which actually isn't a bad thing to think about if you think about what the Nijūichidaishū actually mean, what imperial anthologies were actually composed for. We have to go all the way back to 1921, in fact, for this, when the then Crown Prince of Japan, Hirohito, paid a diplomatic visit to the UK. Now, he saw a range of different places, but there was time at the end of his itinerary for a quick visit to some of the more intellectual centres of the UK, and one of these places he went to was, in fact, Eton, and was shown Eton Library and all of the various treasures and books which they had in there. He inquired on his visit whether they had any Japanese literature or any works in Japanese in the library, and of course the answer was no. So he said and decided that he would do something about this. And on his return to Japan, recruited a well-known figure and gave them a budget of the princely sum then of 1,000 yen to buy some work of Japanese literature which could be sent over to Britain. And what did the factotum come up with? But, of course, the complete Nijūichidaishū collection. Now, this was due to be sent off relatively swiftly to the UK, but the dispatch process was interrupted by the Great Kanto earthquake, which happened in 1923, when, in fact, the copies of the Nijūichidaishū, which had been purchased and were being stored in the Crown Prince's palace, were damaged in a fire. So they had to actually recruit someone to rewrite some of them in order to send it off. And the collection was sent and arrived in Eton in 1925, where basically it sat in the library in a cupboard because no one could read pre-modern Japanese, particularly pre-modern Japanese written in calligraphy. And there the matter rested. But until it was rediscovered by one of the boys who did a little research project on it and found out all about the provenance of this mysterious Japanese-related object. And this put them in mind of celebrating the visit of Prince, who then became Emperor Hirohito, to the school. So in 1919, I was invited to go down and take a look at the anthologies and give them some ideas about what could be done in terms of an exhibition to celebrate it, with the aim of putting on an exhibition in 2021, what am I saying? But of course, the pandemic intervened, and so matters got delayed. Curation of the exhibition was turned over to the extremely able Monica Hinkle from SOAS, as I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, someone with curatorial experience, and it's now opening today, in fact. So I'm delighted to actually be able to go and have a look at it, and I'll give you a full report with some video and pictures in a few moments. So carry on watching. Here we are at the entrance to the exhibition, which is being held in Eton's Verey Gallery, which is provided with the generous support of Sir David Verey. It's located in the far left corner of Eton's main quadrangle after entering past the Porter's Lodge. Any successful exhibition involves a large number of people, and it was nice to see me being thanked for my own small contribution. More on that later. The main theme of the exhibition in terms of poetry is the seasons, and so the Chinese characters for winter, autumn, spring and summer are displayed on the far wall. But we start with a small display of treasures related to Hirohito's visit to Britain and Eton, including photographs, a scrapbook and relevant newspaper clippings. The visit took place on the 27th of May 1921, and the school company was assembled to shout "Banzai," an expression which means 10,000 years, and is used to cheer the emperor and members of the imperial family in a wish for their long reign and health, like "God save the Queen" or "God save the King" in English. Here we have some beautiful images of some famous pre-modern poets. The lady is the inimitable Ono no Komachi, the archetypal passionate woman poet, whose most famous poem is "Hana no iro wa utsuri ni keri na, itazura ni wagami yo ni furu nagame seshima ni." The colour of this flower has already faded away, while in idle thoughts my life goes by as I watch the long rains fall. The flower she refers to is, of course, her feminine beauty, just as much as it is a blossom in her garden. The male poet is Otomo no Kuronushi, with the painting being by the 18th century master Hokusai, whose famous wave and Mount Fuji image has sparked innumerable imitations and derivations. On the scroll, we can see 3 of the 36 poetic immortals, Sanju Rokkasen, a list of famous poets put together by Fujiwara no Kinto at the beginning of the 11th century. The painter is unknown, but the scroll dates from the late 16th or early 17th century. Here we have the centrepiece of the exhibition, the actual box containing the Nijūichidaishū, with one of the volumes opened out so you can see how the poems were written. The anthology shown is, of course, the famous first one, Koki no Akashu. In this cabinet, we have the actual letter sent with the anthologies from Japan, along with another couple of volumes to examine. The Eton collection has also provided a silver Japanese cigarette box and an Imperial Award honouring Frank Ashton Gwatkin, a British diplomat and Eton alumnus, who wrote a number of novels under the pseudonym of John Paris, describing life in Japan in the 1920s and 30s. In this small space, a moment of isolation from the exhibition room, we have the complete listing in order of all 21 Imperial anthologies, as well as Manyoshu. It gives a good sense of the span of time they covered, as well as their naming conventions. A couple more beautiful objects, including a scroll and a lovely picture of a woman wearing juni hitoe, multiple kimono in different colours, which was the standard attire for noblewomen in the Heian period. Different colours, thicknesses of silk and lengths of sleeves allowed ladies to send subtle messages about the seasons and their feelings, and it wasn't unusual for the only part of a woman a man would be able to see to be her sleeves, artfully protruding from beneath the blinds of a carriage or a chamber, showing her good taste and fashion sense. Adding a splash of colour, we have this contemporary, well, it dates from 1920, so it is over 100 years old, kimono, decorated with cranes, one of the key poetic symbols of health and longevity. Finally, 4 poems, one on each of the 4 seasons. presented in Japanese script with modern transcriptions and translations by yours truly. The poems are composed on the first day of spring. Haru no kuru ashita no hara o miwataseba, kasumi mo kyou zo tachi hajimekeru. Spring has come this morning to the fields of Ashita. Gazing across, the haze today has begun to rise. Composed when feeling that it was the end of the 4th month. Uno hana no muramura sakeru kakine oba, kumo mao no tsuki no kage kato zo miru. The Deutzer, blooming in profusion along the brushwood fence, through the cloud breaks moon light do appear to be. Composed on autumn leaves. Yoso ni miru mina no momiji ya chirikuru to fumoto no sato wa arashi o zo matsu. Seen afar upon the peaks are the scarlet leaves, scattering down. The houses at the mountain's foot await the wild storm winds. Composed as a winter poem. Yamazato wa fuyu zo sabishisa masarikeru, hitome mo kusa mo kareru to omoeba. In a mountain home, winter is when loneliness overwhelms me. The bustle of folk and the grasses too have withered away, I feel. There was a Japanese high school teacher at the exhibition with some of his students, and he told me that this last poem is one of the most famous and is included in every Japanese high school textbook for students to interpret and appreciate. I hope you enjoyed it, and the others too. Well, that's it for the exhibition. There are a couple of other objects which I haven't pictured, as they're less strictly Waka related, so there's a bit more to see than I've shown here. The exhibit runs until the 16th of April 2023, and if you happen to be in the area and would like to take in some Waka objects, then I heartily recommend paying it a visit. See you next time. Put any questions you might have in the comments, and please subscribe to the channel for more Waka updates.